Hey everybody, welcome to another fun-filled, exciting episode talking about your favorite health insurance, everybody's most exciting topic that they love to talk about, but it's actually become probably the number one talking point in the country right now. It's the crux and the catalyst of the current government shutdown that is now record for the longest government shutdown in history. And at this current time, it doesn't look like there's any sign of that breaking. Jeff, maybe you can kind of chime in of what we're hearing from our industry friends and kind of where the update is there.
Yeah, we got an update yesterday from some of our government lobbyists, and they told us, worst news, we're looking at probably December now if subsidies are going to be renewed. They also were talking about open enrollment for ACA. Either it's going to be stop on January 15th, and then they think it could reopen on March 1st and run all the way through April rather than it being continuous, just because of how late into the year they're starting to look at this. The other talk is open enrollment might now just go all the way through April. So those are kind of the two big talking points, and we heard that from multiple lobbyists back in D.C., so that's starting to look that way. Not good news on the government shutdown still. There are 10 of those S words from one side of the aisle that's trying to work with the other side of the aisle that looks a little bit promising on at least getting the government open, but, not looking good. Maybe sometime next week we're being told, this whole air traffic control being shut down too is what gotten people kind of rallied up about it. 10% of flights being reduced.
Well, basically everybody in the country starting to be affected. And I think all citizens, like we talked about maybe last week, are frustrated when the gov does this because literally nobody wins. And I think that the Ds are just figuring, hey, they're just running out the clock. They have really no incentive to get the government back open. And the Rs think that they're going to win some sort of political points over sticking to their guns and basically forcing everybody to see how expensive healthcare has come, especially on the ACA side of things. There's all sorts of posts going around about premiums going up, and we're going through annual enrollment. A lot of companies are going through their benefits for open enrollment as well. And just everybody's eyes are opened to how catastrophic healthcare has become in this country. And, it's one of the things that I think we should take a deeper dive into, kind of just analyzing things from all sides, because I think even in our industry, insurance agents and healthcare executives, sometimes it's hard to see the forest from the trees and kind of go, well, how did we get here? And of course, anybody that's unbiased and balanced can say that there's certainly plenty of blame to go around. And I just kind of wanted to go through some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And obviously when your personal livelihood and income and your feeling of production and self-worth and contribution is tied to a particular industry. And one of the things that we've talked about often on this podcast is how much fulfillment that we've got before out of helping consumers find a good policy, get coverage, feel safe and secure, and helping people with their health and wealth. And it's that feeling is getting harder and harder to have these days as the industry has just become so catastrophically expensive everywhere. And it seems like it doesn't matter who you are in the healthcare ecosystem, everybody is frustrated, where it just feels like we're at this really crucial tipping point. And I look around and I go, how do we fix this? How do we start making progress in the right direction? One of the things that I was talking to Jeff about the podcast that's been on my mind a lot lately is we talk about health insurance, right? We call what we currently have in America health insurance. And really, health insurance isn't even real insurance anymore, because we've completely changed the rules of how these carriers are forced to operate and what we want, what we expected, what we've passed as legislation in this country. And insurance, I think, is a wrong word for what we currently have in the system. And, one of the things that we talk about often in this country is, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're an R or a D or how you feel on the political spectrum, but everybody wants good quality, affordable health insurance. Mm-hmm. And the reality is it's just not that simple. And everybody wants to have no skin in the game. They want it all to benefit them, but they don't want to have to actually accept some of the realities of the situation where healthcare costs money. Good healthcare costs money. And it's becoming increasingly expensive to offer that for a myriad of reasons that we want to talk about today. But back to my point about, health insurance isn't really insurance anymore. If you compare that with, say your auto insurance or your home insurance or any like life insurance, any other type of insurance that we have out there, these companies are able to use a whole host of actual things where they use actuarial principles. They're able to analyze risk accordingly. They're able to use underwriting and rating. They're able to use loss mitigation techniques there and requirements for certain things. And they're able to somewhat predict those outcomes, right? Without any sort of catastrophe out there. We've talked even on this podcast before about like catastrophic events or natural disaster type things. But when it relates to healthcare, we have decided at this country that these insurance carriers must be forced to not use any of these things that can help keep cost controlling methods in place. And when you talk about the ACA and how that's basically costs have skyrocketed since then, there's a lot of reasons why. There's truth to that. And look, I don't think anybody ever liked the fact that you could deny somebody for pre-existing conditions, because every human on this planet and every American at some point somewhere is going to have somebody they love or some sort of health circumstance happen to them that is outside of their control, that they would like to have covered, that you don't want something to ruin you financially because, you had a loved one get sick or have an accident or things like that. So we decided that we were going to make that no longer a thing. Well, if you compare my analogy to health insurance isn't really insurance, it's basically a forced shared pool of risk adjustment that we are all forced to participate in and share the costs in, and the carriers are forced to cover as well and then somehow try to make a profit. That's the way we're at. And my analogy would be is if I'm a 25-year-old with a sports car, and I've been this guy before, or I'm a 23-year-old with a bullet bike and I've got 1 million speeding tickets and I'm driving crazy. Actually, I'm a bad because I never had an accident, but let's say you have accidents and you're driving fast, you're very, very high risk. Well, of course, your auto insurance premium is going to be through the roof. In fact, you may not even be able to get coverage, or you have to get some sort of the state risk pool because you're such a high risk. Well, you compare that with the soccer mom or the middle-aged dad that's never had an accident, that drives a minivan, that never gets a speeding ticket. Well, of course, that individual's premiums, their auto insurance premiums, are going to be lower. Well, if you use that same analogy now, whether you're getting employer-sponsored healthcare or you're on Medicare or you're getting it through the ACA or Medicaid, there's nothing that you could do as an individual basically that would preclude you or be able to allow an insurer to risk adjust you properly. And my analogy of the drivers would be, if you're a healthy 21-year-old that doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, goes to the gym, works out, the pinnacle of health, that person's risk portfolio is significantly less than, let's say, a middle-aged person that's morbidly obese, smokes, does literally nothing to take care of their health, has no personal responsibility in their healthcare, but yet those two individuals would have the same premium. And so I guess there's some self-reflection that everybody needs to do and kind of have some understanding of we can't have it both ways, right? We can't have a system where there's absolutely zero personal accountability, that we want anything and everything to be covered, that we want everything to be equal, and we want it all to be spread and shared out. And then we also want to complain about how expensive everything is getting. And I see people out there simultaneously advocating for one set of these principles and want one thing with health insurance, and then are simultaneously complaining about how absolutely catastrophic it's been. And I just think that there's a lot of things that we really need to implement in health insurance overall, but in healthcare as the country, that can kind of get us back on the right track, because it feels like we are on the edge of a cliff where we've talked about it, where people's current health insurance premiums are now the same as their mortgages. And that's just not sustainable, because I mean, as we know, house prices are catastrophic as well. And it's been interesting to me, and I've been a little bit annoyed about how a little bit of tone deafness from some of our current politicians to talk about how this is cheaper, or this expense, eggs are a little bit less expensive, and this, but nevertheless, health insurance is so
going up 30%.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, I could buy a lot of eggs for, the increase in my premium on my health insurance every month. I don't really give a crap about what the cost of eggs are or gas in relation to my, interest rates and housing and healthcare. And I think that's where a lot of people in the country are getting. But again, it's not that simple, and we have to be careful about what we are advocating for and what we want, because we can't have it all and expect there to not be, financial consequences or systemic problems. And additionally, I think that if we decide that we want to have a healthcare system where everything needs to be covered and somebody's going to be forced to pay for it, we have to have adjusted expectations of how that's going to work, right? And when we can't have any underwriting in any sort of this ecosystem at all, when we can't have any sort of real community rating limits, or the rating limits are a 3-to-1 like they are on the ACA side of things, that basically means, just like my analogy with the drivers, is that a healthy 25-year-old is going to pay the same premium as a 62-year-old that's a chain smoker.
Yep.
And I guess that works out really well for the chain smoking 62-year-old, but it doesn't work out so well for the healthy 25-year-old. But that's the system that we've implemented and that we voted on and that we wanted. And now we're having this financial reckoning as a country where the premiums on the ACA have expired, and everybody is aware and alert to the true cost of that. Now, could we subsidize healthcare premiums as a country versus a lot of the other spending that we do in the country? I think there's a reasonable debate to be had there, right? We can find money for a lot of things in the country. And like I said, I think healthcare's a priority for a lot of people. And I personally think, until we can find some other options or plans, just simply saying, oh, well, subsidies are not going to be renewed at all, here's the costs, is a bad idea, because there is no off-ramp, there is no alternative. And it's fine if we want to say, look at all these things that we've done, look at all these downstream effects of what we did prior, now basically live with this. That's okay to say, but you have to have an alternative plan, or you have to have some sort of way of a more affordable or a reversing of some of these premiums if you want to just basically end those. Do you feel the same way?
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, you look at the options that are going on right now. You have young individuals in their 30s. They're the ones who are going to give up health insurance when the premiums are getting high. It's not the people who are ultra sick, and you almost need 10-to-1 on someone who's ultra sick for someone who's healthy to offset those premiums. Well, when everyone in their 30s, a lot of them without kids who never go to the doctor, just pay their premiums. That's kind of what gets going back to that P&C analogy, your risk pool kind of off balances. And you look at where the costs have gone up on ACA, for example, this year, national average, you're in the 20s, sometimes in 30s, depending on what state you're in on an increase. A lot of that has to do with, hey, these people aren't going to pay a premium. They're going to leave the healthy ones. But who's going to pay the premium? People who are ultra unhealthy, and your risk pool is going to go through the roof. I think we're going to see an increase again in 27. And this year, the increases are massive. There's going to be more coming.
That's a great point. And, staying on the ACA train of thought, one of the original components that a lot of people didn't like was that there was that healthcare mandate, basically forcing everybody to have health insurance. And what the intent is to force everybody and healthy people to pay into the same system so it could share that cost out. And what Jeff is saying is the individual mandate has been repealed because I don't think that's constitutional. And what you're going to see without subsidies is you're going to see these healthier, younger people who are like, the hell with this. I'm not paying $600-$700 or more, $1,500 for my family. I'll get some sort of high deductible thing, or I'll just risk it because, I just can't afford that. And that's just insane. And so those people will stop paying premiums into the system at all. And then the risk pool is that of only sick people, unhealthy people, and the risk pool is going to go up, which causes premiums to go up. So you see how it's this snowball effect of where you don't have any sort of cost control methods in there, where it has no choice but to just compound and grow all the time without any sort of relief.
Yeah, and that's why we think short-term medical is going to do extremely well. They have about a 1 page worth of health questions. Sometimes it's as little as 5 health questions, but your risk pool is going to be in a much better environment, which is going to drive your premium down, though. That's one of the things that this administration did do good, was allowing short-term medical to come back. And in some states, like here in Utah, you're able to have a 3-year plan. Some states, it's only 1, where you're able to lock in that price. And we've seen an uptick in sales in short-term medical because the price is so much cheaper than being on an ACA plan. Or someone who's 64, their husband might have just got on Medicare, and they're going, do I really want to pay that ACA premium of $800 a month for a high deductible plan? Or should I look at a short-term medical plan? Or do I just go without insurance?
Yep, which is
the wrong answer to do at that age.
Yeah, which is kind of the way it was before ACA even was passed, and that was the way. But there were still other mechanisms, and even then, the people who thought that was unaffordable then, proportionately to how it is now, it's 8-10 times more expensive.
Right. But one of the big issues too is what's the plan? If we don't give the subsidies, what's the plan? Yep. I haven't seen one plan come out with, hey, this is a better option. This is where it is. That's why it's a little bit ridiculous that we still haven't had subsidies, or at least some type of a direction of, hey, this is where we're going to cut it off on an income level. And we all agree, yes, subsidies were way, way, way too high for people. People have to, you're selling a product. Nothing should be free in this world. But, to a certain level, yeah, maybe we should subsidize it to that level. But when you're going, in the 400+% range, all the way down to 150%, zero premium, yeah, it's a product. When someone has to pay for something, it's a tangible asset where, if you have a $5 skin in the game, at least and something's there. And that's going to get rid of a lot of the fraud, which would drive down that healthcare cost as well. But it's like, hey, what's the plan? Why are we playing this games right now that's now affecting everything across the country without any plan? Let's put our pants on and get to work and try and get something fixed in the future. But we got to have stuff moving for people, because right now they're in open enrollment having to make a decision with knowing that, hey, this price really is going to change no matter what.
Yeah, that's with the 400% premiums, where basically we got to the point where 80% of people on ACA were paying $0 out of their own pocket. Of course, any side of the aisle, anybody on the political spectrum, you get used to the way things are. You get used to your benefits. And then we're seeing the same thing with the SNAP and the EBT. Once people get used to how things are a certain way, and they feel that, that government support, that government subsidy, that entitlement, it's very hard to unwind that at all, or it's met with extreme force resistance. And that's an entire, topic and podcast for another day. But that's where we're at. And like you said, there is no current other alternative. You can't just be, this is the way it is, and we have no other alternative plan, but we don't like it and you don't like it. Just kind of closing the loop on the analogy of health insurance isn't really insurance. What it mostly is it's turned into a giant utility bill for Americans for a prepayment of all of our health conditions. And so there is no actual real insurance. It's basically a shared pool of costs for all of our nation's healthcare costs. Now, going deeper on that, there are other factors that have come into play over the past 12 years, not just the structural things that happened with the ACA, but we have seen inflation just go through the roof, and that is disproportionately affecting things even on the healthcare side of things, because everybody wants to, like that South Park episode, everybody's got their nut and everybody wants to cover their bills and everybody wants to make their money, but things have become so expensive, and especially post-COVID, we've had an extreme exacerbation in the healthcare side of things because, it's a double dragon effect where you had health inflation go through the roof the past 5 or 6 years. A lot of that's because we as a country decided we wanted to shut down the economy and print trillions of dollars. And, of course, we're still living with the residual effects of that. But on the healthcare side of things, we basically kicked the can down the road for a lot of people's health insurance. And myself and many others talked about this ad nauseum during COVID and some of the poor effects of the reaction and the lockdowns. And I was seeing my own clients not going to the doctor for 2 years and neglecting health things. And we've seen an absolute catastrophic rise in chronic conditions, in cancer rates over the past 5 years. And again, lots of opinions on why those things are happening, but those are the facts. And so we're seeing utilization has gone through the roof over the past 5 or 6 years. We've seen normal inflation and transitory expenses hit the healthcare ecosystem like crazy. And so just to be able to cover those and be able to, again, for the health insurers to make their nut, they've got to cover all those things and absorb all those things and then also do enough to make their profit, right?
Yep.
So you just see costs just stacking and stacking and stacking. Did you see people, your clients during COVID put off care? And
oh yeah, they were scared to go to the hospital.
Yeah, I mean
that was one big factor. So much different news and different stuff out there, and then they were also just like, I'm going to hold off. And then they were like, oh crap, if I would have gotten something taken care of, now I've got high blood pressure through the roof. Little things like that. People's mental health went way up through the roof because they weren't going and seeking any care for years.
Yeah, and I frankly, I think COVID period in general broke a lot of people mentally and changed people a lot fundamentally, some for better and some for worse, obviously. But there's all sorts of other healthcare factors. Obviously, you have physicians and hospital prices. There's been a lot of competition in that space. Physicians, of course, want to get paid more. And an alarming trend that I'm seeing is how many physicians are actually wanting to get out of the industry right now because they're just not making the money for the stress and the hoops that they have to jump through now compared to, a decade ago.
Yeah.
That's something that's happening. And then you mentioned before too, prescription drug costs. Mm-hmm. Also, we get held by the hair by the pharmaceutical companies in America, and we have the worst pharmaceutical system, again, that just artificially inflates American healthcare costs to no end.
Well, and you get to set your own price. Why would you make it cheap?
Yeah.
Well, you're a publicly traded company, you got to turn profit.
Again, I think the statistics are, somebody could correct me, but I believe 80% of the world's pharmaceutical utilization comes from the United States, which is just insane.
We're the lowest out of developed countries, with the highest cost. It's crazy. So you can go outside the U.S. I mean, how many of you have been in Mexico and gone to a pharmacy and bought, major drugs for a couple dollars, where in the U.S., they're $300, $400 to go do it. And Mexico's not one of the top tier countries out there, and they're able to get, pharmaceuticals at a much cheaper price. It's crazy. And that's what adds into our healthcare costs too, because what's one of the biggest expenses that you're going to have when you're on Medicare? It's a lot of the time it's going to be your prescriptions that they're having to cover. And that's why, we're kind of seeing, prices keep increasing. Look what's happened to the PDP market for agents. Pretty much it's hard to find a prescription drug plan that you're going to get paid a commission on now.
Yeah. The president has his most favored nation pricing that has yet to really do much or kick in. They just announced this week that Ozempic and tirzepatide, the GLP-1s, are going to be a fixed flat cost, which, again, those still seem very expensive for what they are, and that's a Band-Aid fix, but that's one thing. I think in some way that's a little bit of a deal with a pharmaceutical company, again, that I just don't really care about or like. But going deeper on the whole prescription drug things, obviously we get charged the most in America, and then you have the whole PBM layer and inefficiencies and gamification of the cost and system that we have here in the United States that nobody else really deals with. And so you have that layer contributing to the cost there. And then, as we progress with technology and everybody wants good healthcare, I do feel like America has a lot of leading technologies and treatments, and a lot of times those are expensive, right? When we want the best, most cutting edge treatments for healthcare, sometimes those things are more expensive, and if we want them to be covered as well, those increase in costs as well. That's kind of one of the more, acceptable or benign costs I feel like in there. But, then we've kind of seen some labor shortages and physician shortages in the ecosystem. I'll talk about specifically rural. What happens if you don't have doctors or healthcare staff in these rural communities? Well, how do you get them there? Well, you have to pay people more. How do you get people if you want to compete and get the talent and get the physicians, you gotta show them the money, right? So again, there you have another component of healthcare system going up and up. On the insurance carrier side of things, again, they like I said, we call them insurance carriers, but they're basically forced to cover all the things that we make them to, and then have to make their nut on top of it. And I'm not saying that I'm in no way ever going to act like there's not greed and an over emphasis on making profit with some of these companies again. But at least in this current time, it's interesting to me in the business side of things when health insurers are demonized right now, but they're also the least profitable they've been in years and years and years, and none of them are making money, and their stocks are all in the tank, and they're trying to rapidly get back to a point of profitability. And I don't say that to try to get sympathy for these health insurers, because I think, as we've seen over the past 24 months, they've become a villain in our ecosystem, which I think is not necessarily always fair, because they're operating under the system of what we've created and forcing them to do. And so we've seen, of course, they want to get back to profitability. And so what do? They get overly aggressive on certain things. They deny coverage. They try to fudge the numbers here and there. They try to maximize the incentive plans that are there for them for their reimbursement rates on the dollars. And then they also have to adjust their premiums for all of the reasons that we just talked about. Whether you're on the private insurer side of things, we just got our personal rates for our employer-sponsored plan up substantially. If you're on a Medicare supplement, premiums up substantially. ACA, premiums up everywhere across the board. Those premiums have to be increased, right? Well, again, talking about the snowball effect, what happens when premiums go up is people become subconsciously more aware of how much they're paying for their healthcare. And they're like, well, if I'm going to pay this much for it, I might as well get my value out of it. And then the utilization goes up pretty substantially. And, I think that's a pretty universal human nature thing to go, well, I'm spending this amount of money for my health insurance that I'm forced to, and so I'm going to get my money's worth out of it. I'm going to go to the doctor and I'm going to do, which is, again, what you should do. And that utilization again drives costs up.
Yeah, but pay per service.
There's all sorts of administrative costs have gone up through the roof. The other thing, when you look at like fault of costs in the ecosystem, if you look at the share of dollars tied to like essentially bureaucracy in the health administrative side of things and hospital administration and the business side of things compared to actual care delivery, it's gone up substantially year over year from basically 2008. Every year it was, I think it was 30% of hospital administration costs. Now it's like 80%. And if you think of that, that seems pretty insane that, and someone correct me if I'm wrong on these statistics, but when you have a hospital system and 80% of their costs are going to administrators and CEOs and the C-suite versus the actual care deliverers, there's a disproportionate sucking up of those dollars in that part of the ecosystem, right?
You know what's funny what you just said about that? I had someone ask me the other day, hey, how come hospitals have their names on the side of these stadiums? Why are they advertising? That's got to cost tens of millions of dollars for it. And I'm like, well, you got to see what side of the cost it could be coming from the insurance side. And they're like, no, this is just a hospital. They don't have any insurance or anything with it. And it's kind of like, you guys got a point. That could be $10, $20 million to have your name on the side of that stadium.
Well, again, it's big business, right? Yep. For better or for worse. I think it was just 2 weeks ago. It was the UC Miami. Did you see that news story where they unveiled their new lobby to walk into the hospital, and it was this big digital LED board and these like hanging chandeliers, and it looked super nice and fancy, and they're basically going, welcome to this palace for your healthcare. And it was just the current environment for where people are at with how expensive healthcare costs. It was kind of like, hey dummies, that probably wasn't the best. You're not reading the room right now. We're currently government shut down. Everybody's fighting over healthcare costs, and you're going, look at this palace that we're paying for with healthcare versus, people want to just show up and get good care at a hospital. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but your point is, we spend 4-point-something trillion on healthcare in the country with the worst outcomes. And there's a lot of dollars in that financial ecosystem. And so everybody's trying to get theirs. Everybody's branding their systems and their hospitals. And whether you're a nonprofit system or you're a for-profit system, you're sure spending a lot of money on marketing and branding and getting those customers and consumers to go there. This is a whole separate rabbit hole, again, that we could go down. And my daughter I think I talked about it briefly on the podcast, but my daughter just became a nurse, and, she loves healthcare and she loves helping people. Literally, that's why her and her husband are getting into healthcare. And I was talking to her about the whole insidious business side of it for 3 hours the other day. And we had a really interesting conversation. But again, that administrative overhead and market concentrate, that's exactly what I'm talking about, is those costs have exploded where you're going, why is my surgery so expensive? Oh, your name's on the outside of this football stadium and things like that. Well, no wonder my hospital stay is so expensive, because there's a lot of these administrative costs that are needing to be covered as well. And again, there's no option, right? It's not like there's some sort of state or real nonprofit healthcare system that somebody could go to. And again, the additional regulatory and risk adjustments, I think, is really hard for these carriers and the hospital systems when the cheese always seems to be moving, right? Where they come out with I'll use an example of the Medicare reimbursement system, and then they're like, oh, no, we're changing these metrics to the V28 model, and all the ways that you were getting reimbursed and monetizing those things have now changed. We've cut this, we've changed this. Then they have to all go adjust to the new way that they need to conform to get their reimbursements there. And all that regulatory and risk adjustment causes increased costs as well. So there's just a lot of, again, kind of detailing these systemic costs that we're going through. And then the third category that I wanted to talk about, besides obviously the healthcare system, the insurance carriers, was population factors. And, you know, we all live in the world. We all live in America. We all, like I said, we all want good, affordable health insurance. And some people in this country think that health insurance should be a right, meaning just by existing as a human being in America, somebody should be forced to have to cover you and your expenses. And, you know, there's different opinions on that, but we all want good healthcare. And unfortunately, our system has evolved into not being efficient to deliver that. We have a couple factors. We have an aging population. As we know, on the Medicare side of things, we've been talking for years. It seems like almost as long as I've been in the business, about the silver tsunami, right? About the amount of baby boomers aging into the Medicare system. And we're actually almost through. I think there's another 2 years on the quote unquote silver tsunami where that number starts trending down, of all the boomers aging into Medicare. But nevertheless, our population is aging. The average age of the American is increasing. And so that's driving up costs as we age. Of course, more healthcare needs. The other reason why that makes it a little bit more difficult is that you have less younger people that are paying into these systems, right? It's starting to become uneven on the top, where more people are needing to take advantage and take money out of the system than are paying into the system. Yep. So again, costs are going to be going up, right? Another thing, population, we all as humans that want this coverage, the catastrophic rise in chronic conditions and poor health outcomes. And again, this is something that I'm very passionate about. I wish talking about the business of healthcare and helping health insurance and insurance carriers is the root of what we do here at this podcast. But we as a population that are getting healthcare have a role and a share in this too, because, you know, famously, chronic conditions are through the roof. You have the whole MAHA movement that has gained popularity, and there's a whole, whether you agree with that or not, it's very obvious that our chronic conditions have exploded in this country over the past 10 to 20 years. And that's everything from, you know, obesity to cancers to all sorts of these other critical illnesses and diabetes. And all of these things are very, very expensive to treat. You know, we've known autism rates have been on the rise catastrophically. And that was one of the factors of how the MAHA movement kind of came in. And however, we sometimes don't want to have any personal responsibility in our own healthcare, right? We want to not have any sort of consequences for our health decisions that we make. And a lot of people don't want to take personal responsibility for their own healthcare. And I really see an emergence in the world right now. And again, I could talk about this for a lot, where I see half the country or a big portion of the country is really invested in their health and wellness and longevity and makes a proactive effort to try to take care of themselves and realizes the importance. And we're seeing, you know, alcohol consumption going down. We're seeing people wanting to live longer and focus more on wellness and fitness. And then you have another gigantic portion of the population that seems like they don't care at all about any personal health responsibility, and whatever downstream effects of their own personal health choices, somebody else needs to have to foot the bill for them, and nobody wants to have any sort of rate-based adjustments or any sort of shared cost there. Again, back to the analogy of a smoker versus a non-smoker, where we know that there are certain lifestyle factors that people adopt or don't do that cause a disproportionate effect on the healthcare system. So I think that that's a huge reason why we're in the boat that we're in as a country, is because we've decided that we want to be an unhealthy population. And again, there's a lot of factors that go into that: environmental factors, food factors, the pharma agri complex, the the poisoning of our food systems and the microplastics and all. And I don't, hopefully I don't sound too much like a tinfoil hat guy, but I'm passionate about all of that stuff. And of course, all of those things have had a ballooning catastrophic effect over the past 20 years as we have had unhealthy food and poor health choice consequences in this country. And so I think that I don't want to sound too dire here, but there's all of these factors that we have to start correcting, because if we don't, where we're heading is just not sustainable, because costs are just going to continue to increase, subsidies, whatever, no subsidies, but we're just going to keep careening off this cliff with our healthcare side.
Well, I mean, if prices keep going up and cost of living, you're not making as much, but your healthcare costs are going this much higher. Interest rates on your home that you've already alluded to, they're at a really high. It's unaffordable for people to buy homes right now, and your healthcare cost keeps going up. But hey, you're not making as much off of your COLA. It's eventually going to cost you. You look at Social Security on their raise on the cost of Medicare. It's going way too high, and the amount of money people are making is just not catching up. And we're at a point where, if stuff doesn't get fixed here in the next couple of years, it's going to become just so unaffordable for everyday people.
Yeah, I have one more point, and then I want to kind of add on to what you'd said. But, obviously we talked about population factors. One more thing is, that I think it's hard to ignore, and I think it's hard to be politically neutral on this, but as we've had, a lot of immigration was a major factor in this healthcare explosion over the past 6 or 7 years. Oh, freaking 6 or 7. Stupid kids, brain rot my brain.
6, 7. 6, 7. 6,
7.
Anyway, look, there's no way I had ChatGPT and Grok kind of do an estimate for an unbiased estimate and look at politically neutral sources for an estimate of cost to cover, quote unquote illegal immigrants or immigrants who come here undocumented over the past 12 years. And that's anywhere between $180 and $300 billion of increased costs into that system. And these are sources like the Congressional Budget Office and FAIR and JAMA, which I don't think is unbiased. So I think these are pretty low estimates and figures, but that has definitely, we saw it especially on the ACA side, is it did increase the amount of people that were getting costs and absorbing costs onto the healthcare system and sharing out those again, spreading out those costs to other people.
They're one of the biggest factors why the premium went through, and even the carriers are now admitting they're for a little while. Carriers are like, yeah, give us all the enrollments, and I'm like, hey, you guys are going to cost this, and look what just happened. Prices have gone way up. Now the carriers are like, whoa, we don't want these type of enrollments. There for a minute, they were like, yeah, our numbers are going up. This is a great thing. Well, cost of care goes way up, and it bit them. It really has. And that's, I think, why ACA, you're seeing a much higher increase than you are on the Medicare side right now.
Yeah. And there's a fair debate to be had over the economic benefit and boost to immigration, legal or otherwise, versus costs on the system. But I think it's very fair and very safe to say over the past 12 years, especially, in my analysis, obviously the increases. It's fairly well known that during the prior administration, unchecked immigration was rampant and through the roof, unsustainable by a lot of people's opinions. And that has definitely contributed to the increased cost factors of where we're at now. And that's one of the arguments currently going on is, we can't extend these benefits to those people who are not proportionately paying into the system, because again, it causes a disparate burden on those who are paying into it.
Yeah, they were all on zero premium.
And it's not this, trying to be inhumane or anything like that. It just, economic realities are hitting us very hard right here. And then the final thing that I would say, and this is kind of across all of those categories, the healthcare industry, the carriers, and population, is fraud. The fraud that's been in our system. And, I listened to Elon Musk's most latest podcast with Rogan, and just what's interesting to me is he had a peek behind the curtain of all the fraud that was going on, and he talks about the bank shot fraud that was going on with Social Security numbers and things like that, and he estimates our annual fraud somewhere, I believe it was between 600 and 800 billion, and a lot of that is putting extreme pressure on these healthcare systems, because a lot of the fraud comes in through Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud, ACA fraud. And guys, it was real. It is still real. And we experienced it firsthand. We have seen many fraudulent enrollments and entities that were bad actors that were enrolling not real people, dead people, people who shouldn't qualify, homeless people, people who had no idea that they had a plan on the ACA side of things. We saw it and we experienced it firsthand. And those things are not inconsequential. All of those things contribute to driving up costs. And one of the things that I was hopeful for of driving down the cost of healthcare was rooting out and eliminating a lot of this fraud, and then basically seeing that proportionately decrease the costs. And we've yet to see that make any sort of effect at all. And it seems like every single day we hear of some sort of news story of this carrier got popped or sued, or the DOJ went after him for this abusing this risk score or whatever it is. But yet none of that correction has made its way into lowering the cost of our healthcare system. Yeah. And so I think that we need to take an intelligent, nuanced thought to what we want and where we're at, and that it needs to be an all hands on deck approach to fixing the costs of our healthcare system, and that all of us that I just kind of outlined in this episode have a part to play in driving down our healthcare costs so we can get to some sort of sustainability. And what I was the point I wanted to make with you is, and it's hard to say this without getting censored, but I think that one side of the aisle views this current system, like everything I just talked about, as a need or a propelling towards like a single payer system, or a Medicare for all. And the other side of the aisle sees it as a way to score political points and go, see, you're wasting all of this money and it's become too unaffordable. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're at loggerheads there. And I don't think that either of those are necessarily winning and spelling out their point very well. And it's all of us, it's everybody in the country who are dealing with the consequences. So kind of bringing it all home, what do you think where do you think we go as far as like when this stalemate breaks with the shutdown, and what's going to happen with health insurance, with the ACA and subsidies and enrollment?
So today, right now, it's November 7th. Air traffic control is going to be cut back on. Actually, it started today.
Yeah.
SNAP benefits are now 7 days in where they've been reduced. I give it 2 more weeks, and I think the American people are going to finally be at their breaking point, because you have one side that says, well, you control all 3 branches. Well, guess what? It takes 60 of those S words to get something pushed through. So it's both sides on this. And here's the thing. Everyone knew these government subsidies were going to expire. Why are we playing this game at the last minute?
Yeah.
I want to blame both sides on it. It's like, hey, get this done earlier. Now, if I had my crystal ball prediction, I think that they're going to be renewed for 2 years. I don't think it's going to be 1 year, what people are talking about, because one side of the aisle isn't going to want that in an election year. You hit it spot on. That would be one of the dumbest things. Now, I think one side wants it that way, but I think we're going to have 2 years of it, and then there's going to be some type of legislation, which they tried during the first term, to get some new version of it. That's where my crystal ball prediction is onto it. Kind of where we're hearing from government lobbyists, all of them are kind of saying the same thing, and they're all doing that. Usually kind of ends up is December's looking like when we're going to get that answer. Now, first, they have to open up the government before we can get that to go. Maybe they do it all at once. I doubt it. I think the government's got to get open, because SNAP benefits, air traffic control, it's got to get figured out. It's going to take one time for some plane to crash, and the American people are going to lose it. There's already been close calls.
We had a plane crash.
Yeah.
That wasn't, an air traffic control thing, but that UPS plane crashed last week.
But talking more, tribute to air traffic control. I mean, Colorado International Airport says that they want to pay the air traffic control because they're worried about their citizens around for what's going on. That's how crazy what's being played with people right now. And I think the American people are just getting so pissed at both sides that it's at its breaking point where it's like, hey, stop pointing the finger at the other person and just do your damn job at this point. And so I think that's where we're kind of on a timeline. I give it probably, I don't think it's going to be next week. I'd love for it to happen, but I just don't see that happening. But I do think, because we all know how great it is in Washington, they want to go home for Thanksgiving. I think if the government's still shut down, they're not going to be able to leave because I think they're going to hold them there till there's a deal. So I think that's going to be our point where, hey, we're going to have something no matter what done during that, because who would want to affect, people who work for you on their vacation? So I do think the government will be open by then, and I do think subsidies are going to come back, and I think it's going to be at least a 2-year extension. Now, I'm going to guess it's going to be right around that $120,000 income range and below, you will get a subsidy. If you're making more than that, I don't expect you to have any subsidy moving forward. And you know what? I think that's probably a fair range to be on it. You got to pay into it, kind of where we just talked for the last hour about risk pool. You got to have some type of skin in the game, and everything can't be given to you for free.
Yeah, I do think, though, just because I've looked and played around in Health Sherpa with some of the premiums for even once you're under 150, is 154,000 of income, when you cross that threshold, your premiums get pretty crazy.
It gets ridiculous.
And even at 120, with the way that the current is, I still think in relation to your budget of a household family that's making $120,000 a year, you're really paying after taxes, maybe taking home $8,000 if you're lucky, probably $7,500.
He means per month on that.
Yeah. Then paying $1,500 or $1,200 for your family premium is still
on a high deductible plan. You're not talking a nice plan.
Yeah,
either.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's still catastrophic, and then to still have an $8,000 family deductible and fairly high co-insurance, it's crazy. And I feel, you can see the gray in my beard. I at least have enough of my own personal experience. I was just thinking as I was prepping for this podcast, in 2013 right before 2012, right before Obamacare actually went into effect, I was self-employed, and I had a really nice 80/20 Blue Cross plan for my family of 5 young kids for $300 a month.
Hey, Dan had one of those plans till about 2 years ago. He kept his grandfather plan for that whole time because it was such good insurance.
Yeah, and it had gone up, but it was still proportionately better because he'd been grandfathered in on that plan. But I just look and go, that same plan would probably be considered a platinum plan or a gold plan.
Oh, easily.
For my family, and without any sort of subsidies, that same plan would be what, $2,500, $3,300 a month. Mm-hmm. So when people talk about premiums 10xing over 10 years, it's true. Yeah. So I don't really know what the point of this whole episode, other than to just dig in. And I think if you're an insurance agent out there, it's very helpful to have a nuanced understanding of why costs are so expensive on Medicare. I think when you are a really savvy and sophisticated agent and you can have a conversation at least with some sort of intelligence with your clients and explain to them all of these conditions. And, I know everybody wants to point their fingers at one person or one side of the aisle politically or one company or companies or industry and say, this is why these costs are so expensive, but it's not. It's all of it. It's the whole ecosystem, and it's all of us, and it's the whole systemic effect.
I think people really should take your analogy at the beginning about auto insurance and how that relates to health insurance and the risk and where that goes. I thought that was awesome. And I don't think even a lot of agents really even understand, hey, person right here who has all these chronic conditions, using the hospital system like crazy, pays the same amount as that person who never goes. It's the exact same. And would you think that is fair for you to pay on your auto insurance? That's why our premiums are going up so much. I thought that was an awesome analogy that you gave.
Yeah, if I'm being, libertarian, which I am, and I go, nobody wants to have their life ruined financially over a surprise health condition.
Absolutely.
An accident, a critical illness, like I'd mentioned before. But I do think there's a world and a scenario where people who are not invested in their own outcomes, in their own health outcomes, probably should have more skin in the game than somebody who puts an effort into it. And again, I'm not saying that we just make a system that eliminates any personal responsibility and accountability for lifestyle choices. And I think that's bad. But again, I'm not in control of those things. I do think that if we really wanted to kind of get some sort of control over those things, outcome-based premiums or things that you could do, I do think there's a world where, yeah, if you're going to the gym and you are a healthy BMI and you don't smoke and things like that and do things that we know socially and health-wise that do compound and cause catastrophic costs on the back end of healthcare, I think that there's got to be some sort of mechanisms there, incentives to drive behaviors that will overall substantially lower costs down. And without anything like that ever, you're just going to see people that have no actually invested interest in their own personal health outcomes, or whether there's no benefit physically, financially, or there's no penalty. And it goes back to the psychology of people are way more willing to not have a penalty than they are a potential benefit. Absolutely. And what I mean by that is, if I said you can do this and potentially win $1,000, or you could potentially lose $1,000, they're way more adverse to losing that $1,000. And that's just how most human psychology is. And so there's just this incentive thing where if there's no penalty or there's no negative consequence to any sort of actions, they're not going to find the desire or the need to make a significant change for a lot of people. And it's just unfortunate that it's that way. But I think that they're, personal choice and responsibility in our, with our neighbors and our citizens and our fellow Americans, there needs to be some of that. Otherwise, you're exacerbating a problem.
Yep.
That wasn't really my goal of this podcast, but those thoughts are my own. Anyway, guys, I hope this was helpful in some way. Curious to know your comments. Hopefully we can get some good reels cut up out of this, because I've noticed that there's definitely a big interest in our current healthcare costs in our system right now. And it's on top of mind for everybody at this time of year.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.